Thank you, Johnny. Man, I am so excited to be with you. Our company publishes the New King James Version of the Bible, and I understand that a lot of people here use that, and I'm genuinely grateful for that. We refer to it sometimes by its shorthand name, the Holy Bible, but it's my favorite translation. I thought I'd tell you just a little bit about my personal story as I get started. I didn't have the privilege of growing up in a Christian home. My life was pretty good. I didn't really have any problems to speak of. In fact, I was kind of a ladies' man, especially with the older ladies. But like so many people, I got bored with life. In fact, you could say I got disillusioned. And I decided that I would deal with my pain by becoming a bit of a tough guy, which didn't work out too well, especially when I encountered another 7-year-old who followed me home after school and punched me in the nose. So I decided I would reform my ways and I would become a bit of a Boy Scout. And yeah, is that awesome? I got a lot of approval for that, and I loved earning those little badges. You know, that was kind of fun. But, honestly, I came to the realization that I was a bit of a dork, and that probably wasn't going to work for me. So then I got interested in sports, and I noticed that the girls really seemed to like baseball players. And so, I'm not saying I would, had the potential to be, an all-star or anything, but I was pretty good. And, for a while that worked. Had a little difficult time getting the hat to fit quite right. But that didn't seem to win me much favor with the opposite sex either. So I did what a lot of young men do, and that is I took up the guitar. And I really had these dreams of being in a rock band and being famous and meeting that really cute girl. But when I got to Baylor University and I faced the competition, people like Brian, I thought, you know what, I don't really have the chops. This really isn't going to be that practical as a career choice, and I need something where I can make a living, something that's really practical. So I switched my major to philosophy. Actually, I intended to go into seminary, but got involved in the publishing business. And I got to tell you, in my junior year of college, I got very serious about following Christ. I'd only become a Christian in my freshman year, but a speaker challenged us to get very serious with our Christian life. So I swore off dating, and I got very serious. And then at an event at our church, one Sunday evening, I walked into the event, and I saw Mrs. Hyatt. She didn't know it at the time, but it's like everything came to an abrupt standstill, and everything went into slow motion, and I knew within 90 seconds this was the girl that I wanted to marry. Now, it took her a few more months. She wasn't quite as convinced, but I was. And we've been married now for 32 years. Thank you. We got engaged in October, and we got married in July, and 32 years later, I love this woman more today than I did on the day we got married. Together we have, I'm not making this up, 5 daughters. I know. Takes a real man to have that many daughters. My little brother, interestingly, has 5 sons, and so I razz him about this all the time. But I do suffer from estrogen poisoning. Fortunately, I have 3 sons-in-law, Chris and Nathan and Joel, and they are a great blessing to me. Gail and I have 5 grandchildren, these 4, and then we just had, in October the 1st, this one, Ben.
Ben is 4 months old. Yesterday. Hi. Oh, you have 5?
Well, grandkids are definitely the best part of being a parent. They're really the reward. And if I could have figured out how to go straight to them, I would have. But grandkids are fantastic. I want to talk to you this morning about a pretty serious subject, though. I've been a Christian now for 37 years. I've worked with a lot of Christian authors, a lot of Christian recording artists. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of them fall by the wayside, get taken out for one reason or another. When I was in college at Baylor, Liberty didn't exist at the time, or I would have come here, I'm sure. But there was a speaker that said to us, a group of men in my college, he said, look, by the time you're 50, 10% of you will still be on fire for the Lord. Most of you will be compromised in your faith and settled into a comfortable lifestyle, and some of you, tragically, will not consider yourself Christians anymore and will have fallen away. And he said, if you're going to last, if you're going to make it, it's going to be because you make a decision that you're going to be in the 10% that makes it. And so I made a determination at that juncture in my life that I was going to still be on fire for the Lord when I was 50, and now I'm 55, and I pray that I will finish well, because I've seen some that haven't finished so well. And people get taken out for all different kinds of things, but I want to talk about what I think is the number one thing that takes people out in their spiritual pursuit. It hampers their marriages. It can destroy your career in the business world. It can totally mess up your ministry, and it's this topic, dealing with offenses. Dealing with offenses. And here's my premise, to put it very simply. If you're going to survive, and if you're going to fulfill your God-given calling, whether in business or in ministry, you must learn how to handle criticism and overlook offenses. I didn't always do this so well. When I was 35 years old, I had my own literary agency. And my biggest client, somebody that I really looked up to spiritually, godly Christian man, somebody who had had an enormous impact on me personally, he suddenly, without warning, fired me. And here's the kicker. He didn't do it in person. He didn't do it with a phone call. He sent me a fax. And I couldn't get him on the phone for 3 months. I was devastated. It completely shut me down. I was angry at first. I was completely surprised. I didn't know what the cause of it was. And I wanted to quit. Honestly, I said to God many times, I'm not sure I want to go on as a Christian, let alone working with Christians. And I found out months later that it really had nothing to do with me. I was caught in the middle of an interfamily squabble. But it almost took me out because I got offended and I didn't know how to deal with it, and I almost crashed and burned. I think if you're going to survive and thrive and fulfill your God-given calling, there's 4 truths that you have to embrace about offenses. And I want to give you these one at a time. First of all, offenses are inevitable. Jesus said in Matthew 18:7, he says, "Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes." Now, sometimes these offenses come by way of omission, something that you think somebody should have done, but they failed to do. Sometimes they come deliberately, something that somebody does that wounds your spirit. But Jesus says they're inevitable. They must come. In fact, the Greek means that it's impossible for them not to come. Now, it's not because God in his sovereignty got sidetracked or got busy doing something else and this offense snuck into your life, but it's because God intends something good for them. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. But they must come because God has a great big story for your life. And if he's going to use you to the fullest extent, he's going to have to mold you and shape you and conform you to the image of his dear Son. And that takes work, and it takes pain, and it takes hard things. But in the end, it's worth it. But only if you embrace it. But it's inevitable. I like what James chapter 1 in the Phillips translation says, and this is so different from how most of us react when we get offended or when we get disappointed. James says, when all kinds of trials and tribulations crowd into your lives, my brothers, don't resent them as intruders, but welcome them as friends. That's a very countercultural idea. Daniel Defoe is one of my favorite literary figures in history. He wrote the book Robinson Crusoe. How many of you have read that? One of the first books I ever read, actually, arguably, the first English novel ever written. Daniel Defoe said this: God will often deliver us in a manner that seems initially to destroy us. God will often deliver us in a manner that seems initially to destroy us. Daniel Defoe lived in the 17th and the early 18th century. But listen to this. When he was just 5 years old, the Great Plague of London began. Ultimately, within a year, 70,000 people in London would be dead. The next year, when young Daniel was 6, the Great Fire of London hit Defoe's neighborhood, leaving only his and 2 other houses standing. The next year, a Dutch fleet sailed up the Medway via the River Thames and attacked Chatham, his hometown. When he was 13, his mother died. He wrote, I can't even believe this, but he wrote over 500 books, pamphlets, and journals. He's known to have used more than 198 pen names, and even spent a short time in prison for a pamphlet he wrote. At age 43, he was released from prison, and he immediately witnessed the Great Storm of 1703. This is the only hurricane that ever made its way across the Atlantic and hit the shores of England, and it killed over 8,000 people in 2 days. In 1719, at age 59, he wrote Robinson Crusoe, and he was severely criticized for it. And it would have been easy for him to take offense at his critics, but he felt that God had inspired him to write it. So offenses are inevitable. Brings me to the second point. Satan intends these offenses for our destruction. The Greek word for offenses is the word scandalon, from which we get our English word scandal. And this was a surprise to me as I began to do a little word study about this, but it actually refers, it's a technical term that refers to the part of a trap that holds the bait. And offenses in your life are a temptation that Satan uses like a bait to lure you astray and to get you to doubt the heart of God and to give up on your walk with him. We had a woman at our company recently who was overlooked for a promotion, and she thought she deserved it. And she was enormously capable. And initially, like many of us would be, her feelings were hurt. Fortunately, when she found out the news, it was on a Friday, so she had over the weekend to process it and to think about it. And so when she responded to her boss on Monday, she didn't take the bait of Satan, but she responded beautifully. And as a result of that, her boss is now looking for a way to promote her. But it would have been easy for her to let resentment sink in, for bitterness to kill her spiritual life. And that's what so often happens. People become cynical when they take the bait. This verse in 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." You know, I once heard it described this way: Satan doesn't really have any teeth. Jesus defanged him at the cross, but he still roars, and he scares us. But you and only you can take yourself out by the decisions that you make in response to him. So don't let Satan fool you. He intends it for your destruction. And here's the third truth that I love. God intends offenses for your good. Those things that wound you, that hurt you, that you can't imagine why they happen, God has a purpose, because nothing passes through his fingers except what he has sovereignly appointed. My predecessor, Sam Moore, sometimes when bad things would happen at work, I would go to him and I would have to report the bad news. Maybe our sales were short for the month or something else happened in the business. And he would always take a deep breath and he would say, Mike, is Romans 8:28 still in the Bible? And you know that verse. God works all things together, not just some things. God works all things together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And I would say, yes, sir, it's still in the Bible. And he said, that's what I thought. Don't worry. But God intends these things, these offenses, for our good. Think about, for example, Joseph. You know this story, but let me rehearse it for you quickly. Joseph was ridiculed by his brothers, kidnapped, and then sold into slavery. You talk about the ultimate in family abuse by his own family. He was later falsely accused of attempting to seduce the wife of a high-ranking Egyptian official. He spent several years in prison, falsely accused, and after years was vindicated. Look, he could have been enormously angry with his brothers. He had all the power. He could have had his revenge. And his brothers, at the end of his life, come before him because of a famine. And they seek to get food from him. And the dialogue is fascinating, because he says to his brothers as they tremble there before him, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is this day to save many people alive. I love that verse because it has that strange mystery of the providence of God and man's will, and how God can override even the ill intention of others for our good and for his glory. Another story in the Old Testament. You remember the story of David? Talk about a life of ups and downs. But there was a point later in his life when, again, like Joseph, he was betrayed by a family member. And I don't know why it is, but it often seems like these offenses come through somebody close to us. A family member, a coworker, a boss, somebody you look up to, maybe your own spouse. But David's son Absalom launched a mutiny and took over power, and David is fleeing for his life out of Jerusalem. And as he's fleeing out of Jerusalem, there's a man named Shimei that meets him on the road and starts throwing rocks at him, at the king of Israel, who's being illegitimately deposed by his son. And this guy Shimei comes along and starts throwing rocks. And there will be those people in your life when you're at your lowest point, can't leave you alone, let alone offer an encouraging word, but have to throw rocks. And so here's what Shimei said to the king. Come out, you bloodthirsty man, you rogue. The Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom, your son. So now you are caught in your own evil because you are a bloodthirsty man. Well, Abishai, another guy who's one of David's 30 mighty men and a general in David's army, he says to David, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Please let me go over and take off his head. I love his spirit. You know, I probably would have felt the same way. But notice what David says. This takes profound maturity. And I think it's one of the reasons why David ended well. He said, "Let him alone and let him curse, for so the Lord has ordered him." What profound understanding of the providence of God, that even in this most difficult thing, God had not abandoned David. God was still operative in his life. And there will come a time when you will feel like God's abandoned you. When you think, where is he? Why has he let this happen to me? Does he care anymore? And you'll be tempted to take the bait of Satan and to begin to doubt the heart of God. But oh, that you would be like David and see in that offense something that God intends for your good. Well, there's a fourth truth, and maybe the most powerful one that you have to embrace about offenses, and that is that being offended is a choice. Being offended is a choice. One of my favorite stories, one of my favorite books, is a book written by a Jewish psychiatrist by the name of Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. And it's the story of his incarceration in a Nazi prison camp. And he said he realized over time that he couldn't control what his oppressors did to him. But he had 100% control of how he responded to the abuse. And in that, he found freedom. Because between the stimulus and the response, there's a space, and in that space, your humanity, your opportunity to be like Christ and reflect God is possible because you make a better choice. You're not like my dog. I have a dog named Nelson, believe it or not. And my dog Nelson, when I bring out the dog food, he immediately starts salivating. He can't help it. There's no space between the stimulus and the response. He smells the dog food and he just goes. But you don't have that. You have a space between the stimulus and the response, and you can choose how you're going to respond. It's what makes you human. It's ultimately the measure of spiritual maturity. Sure, there's times when you're going to want to get angry. There's times even when it's proper to confront somebody else. But better to wait. A verse that's really good is also in Proverbs 19 and verse 11. And it says, "The discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and his glory is to overlook transgressions." This is really important. The ability to be slow to anger. I've gone into business meetings before where there was a lot of tension in a boardroom over something that had happened in the business. And my prayer as I've walked into the board meeting, or as I've sat with people I had a confrontation with, Lord, help me to be quick to hear, slow to wrath. Help me to listen and carefully consider my response. Because for some people that you'll meet in the marketplace, you're the only representative of Jesus that they'll ever know. And they will make decisions about what it means to be a Christian, and they'll make decisions about Christ himself, never having read the Bible, but simply by observing your behavior, particularly under pressure. And this is what the early martyrs understood and realized. And this is ultimately what converted the entire Roman Empire, because these Christians went willingly to their death, like their Savior, not opening their mouth, not offering evil for evil, not offering a rebuke, but being content to overlook an offense and entrust themselves, 1 Peter chapter 2 says, to him who judges righteously. Well, let's just talk about how the rubber meets the road. And I just want to give you quickly how to overcome an offense. And this is going to be very practical, just 4 things. How can you overlook an offense? First thing I think is you've got to acknowledge that you were offended. If there's one thing I've learned in being a Christian for 37 years is that pretending gets you nowhere. You can't deal with what you don't acknowledge. And so acknowledging that you were wounded is right. And that's what ultimately saved me when the story I told you earlier with my client who fired me I think part of it was I was so shocked that I was discouraged and despondent. But acknowledging that I had been hurt, that I had been wounded, was the beginning of me clawing my way back to a relationship with Christ. Secondly, remind yourself you have a choice. This is the hardest thing. To remind yourself in the midst of that situation, when your emotions are raw and frayed, that you still have a choice. You don't have to go with the flow. You can choose a better way. And then I think for those of us who are Christians, we can remember that we're really dead to these things. We're really dead to these things. Great story that comes from the Desert Fathers. And I'm just going to read just 3 paragraphs to you. But a brother came to see Abba Macarius the Egyptian, also known as Macarius the Great, and said to him, Abba, or Father, give me a word that I may be saved. And when you read the Desert Fathers, they mean this in the broader sense of being sanctified. So the old man said, go to the cemetery and insult the dead. The brother went there, hurled insults and stones at them. Then he returned and told the old man about it. The latter said to him, didn't they say anything to you? And he replied, no. The old man said, go back tomorrow and praise them. So the brother went away and praised them, calling them apostles, saints, and blessed people. He returned to the old man and said to him, I have complimented them. And the old man said to them, did they not answer you? The brother said, no. The old man said to him, you know how you insulted them and they did not reply, and how you praised them and they did not speak? So you too, if you wish to be saved, must do the same and become a dead man. Like the dead, take no account of either the scorn of others or their praises, and you can be saved. And then a great verse in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 3. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. That's true for all of us. We've been swallowed up into Christ. And we have the great privilege of sitting with Him and letting His life flow with us so that we respond as He would respond. And then finally, forgive the other person and let it go. This is the glory of a man or a woman, to overlook an offense. But the word forgive in the Greek means to let go, like to unlock a prison door so that the other person can go free. But you know what? More often than not, in our bitterness, we're the ones that are being held prisoner. Somebody said that bitterness, and I think this is true, or resentment, is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. But to let it go, to realize that God has forgiven us in Christ, and therefore we're able to forgive that boss, that coworker, that fellow student, that spouse, that child, whomever it may be. Forgive the other person and let it go. Colossians 3 again, therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. I wrote last week on my blog about the incredible power that words have in people's lives. And when I was in junior high school, I had moved from Nebraska to Texas. I was completely in a culture that I wasn't familiar with. Honestly, I could barely understand what my teachers were saying. And I walked into the cafeteria for the first time, and it was in the middle of the semester. So all the other students had their cliques. They knew where to sit. And I didn't know where to sit. So I got my tray, and I just kind of quietly sat down at the nearest table, and I looked down at my food. And I didn't say anything. Nobody welcomed me. I looked up. Some of the other kids kind of snickered. And one of the kids said to me, "Man, you have a really big nose." Well, it killed me. That became like the central defining reality of my life for years. Every time I would look in the mirror, all I would see is a nose. And I thought my whole body was like a life support system for a nose. And then Saturday night, And I was able to get through that, and on my blog I talked about the incredible impact that our words have and how we can so easily offend other people and shape their destiny if we're not careful by the words that we use. And my own daughter on Saturday night said to me, and I hate this when this happens, she said, "Dad, you know that blog post you wrote?" And I said, "Yeah." And I kind of felt like it was a Nathan confronting David moment. She said, "You said something to me when I was 10 years old that I've struggled with," and she's 30 now, "for 20 years. And I made just a frivolous comment about her weight. I didn't even remember what I said, but it slayed her. And thank God she had the grace to confront me, speaking the truth in love, and say, look, I've forgiven you. I'm over it. I've let it go. But I just want you to know." And that was so powerful to me to realize that sometimes we're on the dishing out side and sometimes we're on the receiving side. And this gives us the ability to remember to forgive. Because if people can forgive us for our careless words, for our inappropriate actions, then how much more can we be like what Paul admonishes us here, to forgive others as Christ has forgiven us. Let me go back to my original premise. If you're going to survive, if you're not going to be a casualty, if you're going to thrive and fulfill your God-given calling, you must learn how to handle criticism and overlook offenses. And if you can do this, you will finish the race well. May God bless us as we seek to serve Him. Thank you for having me.